You never notice the small deaths in a marriage until one of them stares you in the face. The mismatched mugs, the love you said while scrolling, the way he stopped asking if I wanted to go on walks and started asking what was for dinner. I noticed, of course, I just didn't mind. I was busy being the reasonable wife, the kind who forgives the noise of routine because she believes in the beauty of ordinary days. So I baked a cake, lemon, his favorite, our thing. I even bought those cheap sparkler candles that hiss and spit light like they're making fun of you for trying. I wanted to remind him that marriage didn't have to be fireworks to still be beautiful. Funny, right? I was trying to be soft in the exact week he was somewhere being cruel. When I walked in that evening, the house smelled expensive: aftershave, candle wax, and deceit. I remember thinking it smelled wrongly perfect, the kind of curated scent you'd expect in a realtor's brochure. Too clean, too artificial. Then I saw the phone. Face up, glowing, betraying. Her name, Tessa, was like a punchline to a joke I didn't know I'd been part of. And her message, so breezy, so familiar. "She's baking the cake for your anniversary. That's poetic." Read. There it was, my sister's sense of irony, alive and thriving in my husband's text messages. I stood there long enough for the screen to dim and for my reflection to appear in the black mirror of it. It's strange how calm betrayal can look in real time. You don't cry, you don't scream. You just stare, you study it. Like something on exhibit, this is what happens when love gets lazy. And then, as if I were rehearsing for an entirely different life, I went to the kitchen and unpacked the cake. I even sliced it. Because why waste something that sweet on two people so bitter? They were in the living room when I walked in, my husband lounging like he owned the air, my sister perched beside him, laughing too loudly at something that clearly wasn't funny. The kind of laugh that insists on being heard. The kind of laugh that dares you to ask why. "Hey," Evan said, startled but pretending not to be. He looked almost guilty, but not quite guilty enough to be human. "And Tessa," she froze, caught between two instincts: run or double down. "Oh," she managed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "We were just catching up," I said, finishing her sentence for her. I smiled, a small, practiced smile, the kind that says, "Don't worry, I know exactly what you've done." I set the cake box down on the coffee table, right between them. The scent of lemon filled the space like truth itself, sharp, bright, impossible to ignore. "Happy anniversary," I said, "to all of us apparently." That's when Evan stood, voice breaking into his usual uselessness. "It's not what you think." "Of course it is," I cut in, calm, level, measured. "I'm not an idiot. I just didn't expect the script to be this cliché." Tessa's eyes were wide, glassy. She was still clinging to her innocence like a wet tissue. "Lena, it just happened. We didn't plan." "No," I said. "You never do. Planning would require self-awareness." There was a silence then, heavy but almost elegant. The kind of silence that fills a space when something is breaking, but you realize it's not you. It's them. And that realization, God, it's addictive. I sat down opposite them, crossed my legs, and took a bite of cake. Slowly, thoughtfully. They both watched me, unsure if I was about to cry or commit murder. "You know," I said, mouth still full, "people always imagine betrayal as this storm, this huge, messy collapse. But honestly, it's more like a change in lighting. One second you think you're standing in sunlight, and the next." I gestured around the room. "You realize the bulbs burned out a long time ago." Evan's face twisted into that familiar look of male confusion. He didn't understand metaphors unless they came with a spreadsheet. Tessa, though, she looked small, diminished, like a child who'd stolen something she suddenly didn't want. And I liked that, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because, for once, she was the one unsure of her place. I finished my cake, wiped my fingers, and stood. "I'll make this easy for both of you," I said. "You can have him." And before they could interpret it as noble surrender, I added, "I'm bored anyway." That landed. The kind of line that echoes long after you leave the room. Later, when the house finally fell silent, I sat on the edge of the guest bed and stared at the wall. The quiet was alive, thick, electric. I thought I might shatter it just by breathing. I opened my notebook, blank pages, empty lines. Then I wrote the first thing that came to mind. Revenge should be both quiet and loud. Quiet enough that they sleep, thinking they've won. Loud enough that, one day, they wake up and realize the entire world moved on without them. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew it would be elegant. It would not be shouting. It would be mirrors and timing and patience. Because that's the thing no one tells you about betrayal. It doesn't just break you. It builds you too. And when I finally did rebuild, they would wish I had screamed instead. The morning after betrayal is quieter than people imagine. No dramatic breakdown, no broken glass or screaming into the void. Just silence. A silence so sharp it could file your heart into something new. I woke up before sunrise. The house was heavy with that stale, expensive air that follows a storm, everything untouched, yet fundamentally changed. Evan was gone, of course, probably at Tessa, playing the tragic lover who didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't chase him. I made coffee. Black, no sugar. Then I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window and realized something strange. I didn't look broken. I looked unfinished. And that, I decided, was a far more interesting problem to have. For years, I had been the nice wife. The dependable one, the sensible one, the kind who bought hostess gifts and remembered birthdays. I dressed like emotional wallpaper, beige, safe, forgettable. Because that's what good women do, isn't it? They soften themselves until they disappear completely. Not anymore. I booked a hair appointment that morning. Chopped off 6 inches, went darker, sleek, modern, slightly intimidating. The kind of hair that says, she knows something you don't. I didn't tell anyone. I just walked into that salon as the woman Evan betrayed, and walked out as someone he wouldn't recognize if she passed him on the street. By evening, I'd cleaned out our closet. Not the way sad wives do it, sobbing into old shirts. No, I did it like an audit. Cold, efficient. Every piece of clothing I ever bought to make him like me, gone. Every color, he said, looked better on you than red, gone. Every memory that smelled like compromise, gone. The donation pile looked like a graveyard for women who wanted to be small. When I was done, I opened a new bottle of perfume. Not floral, not soft, something expensive, spicy, commanding. I sprayed it once, watched it catch the light in the air like defiance made visible. Then I smiled. Because this was the beginning of something he wouldn't understand, strategic evolution. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened. I wasn't going to quit my job and cry into blankets. No. I was going to keep showing up, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, until my very existence became his punishment. And it worked. 3 days later, he called. Not to apologize, oh no, men rarely start there. He called to check in, to see how I was holding up. I said I was fine. Which, in a woman's language, means, you should be terrified. He hesitated. You sound different. I am, I said, sipping my coffee. You should try it sometime. By week 2, I had quietly shifted the narrative. Mutual friends started asking him questions he couldn't answer. They'd seen my posts, lunches, laughter, subtle power. Not one mention of heartbreak, not one public display of pain. Just silence and shine. The kind of silence that makes people curious. The kind that keeps gossip alive longer than any outburst ever could. And as for Tessa, oh, she was radiant in her delusion. Posting couple selfies, #new beginnings. I didn't comment. I didn't block her either. Let her have her stage. I was building an audience elsewhere. One night, I wrote in my notebook again. Reinvention is the most polite revenge. Let them think they hurt you. while you quietly become someone they'll never be invited to meet again. That line stayed with me because I wasn't planning a scandal. I was planning a slow unraveling, the kind that doesn't scream, "Look what you lost," but whispers, "Look what you'll never have again." And that's how my real revenge began. If revenge has a most useful tool, it is the domestic invitation. A dinner invitation is the social equivalent of a phone call that doesn't demand an answer. It asks you to show up where everyone can see you behave. It is a small trap as polite as a linen napkin. I wrote mine the way you would write a good email. Short, clear, and impossible to misconstrue. Saturday, 7 p.m., dinner at our place. Casual, come hungry. L. No flourish, no plea, no accusation masquerading as concern, just a time and a place. I hit send and watched the tiny blue icon flip to delivered with the same calm I'd used to close the closet that morning. The text went to both of them, and to a handful of mutual friends I knew would be curious. Mara from Evan's office, Jonah who lived 2 houses over and prided himself on neutrality, Priya who ran half the neighborhood charity, and a couple more whose presence would make the room feel like a real audience. People always imagine public humiliation as shouting into a crowded room. But the real power is subtler. It's the quiet arrangement of witnesses who will later say, "I was there when it happened." I planned everything, not to humiliate in a sloppy way, but to reveal the truth by the honest light of normalcy. The table was important. I set it with intention, nothing ostentatious, nothing theatrical. White linen, a single runner of eucalyptus, plates with a thin gold rim. I bought new napkins, linen, hemmed because small upgrades are like currency. You spend them and people notice the balance of your life changing. Candles low, so faces read easily under them. I arranged the seating so that Evan and Tessa were diagonally across from each other, far enough to feel the tension, close enough that any purposeful silence bounced between them. The menu was disarmingly domestic: roasted chicken with lemon and thyme, a simple green salad, food that smells like home, not drama. The kind of food that makes people feel safe and therefore talkative. I made a lemon tart for dessert, a small nod to that awful cake, the night of the discovery that had been both the end and the beginning. When they RSVP'd, Tessa first, enthusiastic and quick. "Yes, thanks for having us, Zox," I smiled. Evan's response arrived later. "We'll come." Not sorry, not contrite. Language matters. It's the difference between I and we, and I plan to watch that pronoun fracture. On Saturday, I showered, dressed in the kind of silk shirt men always say they prefer but somehow never notice until it's too late. I didn't overdo lipstick. I let my hair fall in a way that suggested effort with a casual shrug of time. I lit the candles and poured the first wine. Music was soft, a playlist of songs that were neutral and unobtrusive, intentionally curated so no one could call my choices spiteful. Control, remember. Control is invisible when done well. They arrived on time, hands slightly trembling. Tessa's makeup was too bright for the lighting. Evan's laugh was pitched just a little too high. They held hands for a beat in the doorway, automatic coupling without conviction. "Lena," Mara said, hugging me like she'd never noticed my absence. "This looks beautiful." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. People underestimate how disarming gratitude can be. It is the polite toxin of a well-run room. You give people soft things so they lower their guard. We ate. We spoke of small things first. Jonah's kids' soccer game, the new cafe on Maple. The beginning of the meal is always like the surface of a lake where nothing important happens. I let it stay that way. Small talk is the perfect incubator. It lets bad behavior float into view gradually so the witnesses notice when it becomes obvious. At some point, naturally, conversation turned to work. Evan mentioned a new project casually, the kind of casual that reveals a man trying to prove himself competent in a space of attention. I asked a few pointed questions about deliverables, timelines, clients. They were neutral questions. They read like interest. He answered, slightly flustered, and I watched Priya scribble a mental note as she leaned in. Tessa laughed at the wrong moment. It was nervous and too loud. Jonah watched her like a spectator at a game, the way you observe the way the aggressive players move. I noticed Mara's eyes linger on Evan in a way that betrayed curiosity. That was useful. Witnesses were forming opinions without being told to. When the main course plates were cleared, I poured the second bottle of wine and made a casual, off-handed toast. "To honesty," I said, clinking glass to glass. There was a soft silence, precisely the kind I wanted. Evan's jaw tightened. Tessa's fingers drummed the rim of her wine glass. "To honesty," they echoed. Then I told a story, not a confession, not a dramatization, just an anecdote about my grandmother who would always say, "Truth is a household appliance. It does its work best when you use it regularly." People smiled politely. Because stories about grandmothers are social lubricant. But the point landed. Truth as appliance, maintenance as duty. It reframed the evening. People began to listen like it was a lecture they'd paid for. As the evening moved toward dessert, I started planting soft prompts in the conversation. A mention of loyalty in our careers, a joke about the proximity of relationships to temptation, a musing about accountability. I never called out names. I never lifted a finger toward accusation. I only seeded the garden with words that would grow into uncomfortable questions for the people who needed to feel them. Tessa, in her hunger for approval, tried to steer the chat back to Instagram metrics, brand deals, what color palette was trending. She wanted applause, and people tend to hand it out to the loud. But Mara, who knew Evan from work, asked a practical question about his new project's timeline that required specifics, dates, meetings, commitment. Evan hesitated. Tessa chattered around him like a frantic chorus trying to rescue a tune gone flat. It was then that Jonah, who had always been socially cautious, made a small, stupidly honest remark. "You know, I always admire people who follow through." The room, feeling the temperature change, adjusted to the observation. It was a lighthouse blink, short and exposing. Evan flushed. He shifted his weight. "Yeah," he said. "Follow through, important." I poured coffee and offered the lemon tart, slicing it perfectly. I offered Evan a slice first. He looked at it like it might be a test. "No, thanks," he said, voice thin. I smiled a particular smile, the one that is all politeness on the surface and consequence underneath. "Suit yourself." I passed the tart to Mara, whose expression softened as the citrus seemed to reset the palate. The small attentions of ordinary kindness are weaponized best when given freely. At some point, Priya pulled Evan aside to ask about volunteering details for the charity run. She wanted someone dependable. The ask was perfectly mundane. He agreed, nonchalant. Later, as people lingered and the candles burned low, Priya would mention the evening in the next week's committee email. Evan volunteered to coordinate refreshments this Sunday. Nothing scandalous. Just a public appointment in a calendar his name now occupied. Little anchors of responsibility. Little places where follow-through would be visible. By the time they left, they were politely cordial. Tessa hugged me with the same perfunctory pressure she'd used at the door. Evan shook my hand like a man trying to read a contract in the margins of a social routine. Outside, in the cool air, I closed the door and locked it with both deadbolts because ritual matters. The lock turn is a tiny act of sovereignty. I sat for a moment in the quiet after, feeling the residue of the evening like residue on a plate. It wasn't triumph yet. It was data. Names, body language, who noticed which questions, who laughed when. The room had performed, the witnesses had observed. I made a mental tally. This is how the slow, delicious work progresses. You gather facts and faces. You seed accountability in places where it is inconvenient to ignore. You let time amplify the dissonance between public statements and private actions. You make the world a ledger where choices must be reconciled. I poured myself a glass of wine and wrote the evening down in my notebook. Guest list, notes on how Evan had avoided specifics, how Tessa used humor to deflect, how Mara leaned into the practical questions. Little clues, little levers. Later, alone, I scrolled through the photos Tessa had posted. 2 selfies from the night's pre-dinner mirror moment, filtered and smiling. I didn't comment. I saved one image privately for later use. A picture of her in my jacket, looking both triumphant and shaded by light that made her eyes look smaller than they were. Evidence, perhaps, or just a memory. You don't have to shout to make your life a statement. You only need to be excellent at arranging the facts so that the truth becomes inevitable. That night, I went to bed with the peculiar tiredness of someone who had been both gracious and strategic in the same breath. I'd hosted a polite dinner and gathered witnesses. I'd spoken of appliances and follow-through and watched the way certain people bristled at the idea of being tasked. It felt, in a clean, small way, like winning. Not the noisy kind. The kind that accumulates until it becomes a consequence. After the dinner, something subtle began to shift. Not dramatically, just a soft rearrangement of how people looked at things. At them. The world didn't explode, it adjusted. And that's the thing about quiet revenge. It doesn't march in with fanfare. It seeps in through small talk and memory. I started to notice the ripples. Myra from Evan's office suddenly stopped tagging him in project updates. Priya invited me, not them, to a weekend charity brunch. Even Jonah, who prided himself on neutrality, texted, "That dinner was interesting." That's all he wrote. But it was enough, because interesting is the polite word for something's off, and I can't unsee it. Meanwhile, Tessa was performing happiness like a full-time job. Her social media became a bright, relentless theater of coupledom. Latte art, matching sneakers, sunrise jogs. Every post a declaration that everything's perfect, look. Which, of course, meant nothing was. I didn't block her. I didn't comment. I just existed, visibly, quietly, beautifully, a calm she couldn't imitate. And people noticed. At the office, whispers started, the soft kind that spreads under polite smiles. Lena looks amazing lately. She seems happier. What happened with her and Evan again? No one knew, not exactly. I'd given them no story. Which meant they had to make one up, and gossip thrives best in the space left by your silence. One afternoon, Mara called me. Her tone was gentle, cautious, the kind people use when they think they're approaching a wound. "Hey," she said, "I heard about well things. Are you okay?" "I'm wonderful," I said cheerfully. "Why?" A pause. "You just seem so calm." I smiled into the phone. "Oh, Mara, that's not calmness, that's focus." I started a small consulting brand around that time. Nothing dramatic, just helping small businesses with digital strategy. It wasn't about the money, it was about presence. Having something with my name on it. Something Evan could no longer take credit for. Within 3 months, I'd landed 2 clients, one of them a firm he'd pitched to last year and lost. When the contract went public on LinkedIn, I didn't tag him. I didn't need to. People like Mara did it for me. Couldn't think of anyone better for the job. Congrats, Lena. The comments poured in. Dozens of them. Every clapping hands, a tiny social obituary for Evan's ego. Tessa, bless her insecure heart, tried to compete. She started posting motivational quotes about resilience. Then, ironically, she shared one that said, "Sometimes the woman you break becomes the storm you can't survive." I laughed. She didn't realize she was quoting me. I'd written that line in my journal weeks before and posted it anonymously under my brand's tagline. So technically, my sister was sharing my words to defend her choices against me. Poetic, really. Then came the gala. An annual fundraiser, elegant, crowded, important. Tessa had been dying for an invite for years. This time, she got one. Evan, too. What she didn't know, I was on the events planning committee. Quietly, strategically. I picked the seating chart. I didn't separate them. That would have been too obvious. I simply placed them near enough to see me across the room, far enough to know they couldn't approach without causing a scene. I arrived in red. The kind of red that doesn't ask for attention, it owns it. When I stepped into that ballroom, conversations paused in mid-sentence. The air changed temperature. I smiled, slow and deliberate, and let the silence introduce me. Across the room, Tessa stiffened. Evan's hand twitched like a man realizing, too late, that he'd sold his soul for something on clearance. All evening, I was Grace. Poise. Light laughter. My name floated between conversations, like a scent people couldn't quite place. When the photographer asked for a photo of the committee, I stood center, flanked by 2 CEOs and the mayor's wife. The next morning, that photo was everywhere. Front page of the local business magazine. Tagged, shared, celebrated. Evan didn't like the post, of course, but he saw it. And that's the beauty of modern revenge. You don't need confrontation when you have visibility. That night, Tessa posted another cryptic quote. Some people bloom late, but weeds grow fast. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because everyone else already had. The comments beneath her post weren't kind. People had started piecing things together, sensing the falseness behind her performative happiness. And that's how revenge really works. Not by destroying someone's life, but by holding up a mirror so polished they finally see themselves. That night, in my journal, I wrote, "You can't ruin what was already decaying. You just remove the audience before it collapses." And as I read it back, I smiled. Because I wasn't angry anymore. I was brilliantly free. Revenge doesn't arrive in fireworks. It arrives in forwarded emails, whispered updates, and the gentle silence that follows a name being removed from a guest list. By the time spring came, Evan's reputation had begun to crack, not because I ruined it, but because he did. All I did was stop cleaning up after him. It started with the charity event follow-up. Remember Priya, the one who'd asked him to help with the refreshments? He forgot. Completely. On the day of the event, the tables were empty, the volunteers scrambling, and Evan was nowhere to be found. When they called him, he stammered through excuses, a miscommunication, a last-minute conflict. But Priya didn't buy it. She'd seen me that day, calm, composed, handing out drinks in heels and a smile that said everything without words. By Monday, the story had made its rounds. Evan dropped the ball. Lena stepped in. That was all it took. I never corrected anyone. I didn't have to. People love a narrative that rewards grace. Suddenly, I was the ex-wife. I was the woman who handled things beautifully. And he was the man who lost someone irreplaceable. Then came the work scandal. A client backed out of a major deal at his firm, and somehow, confidential emails surfaced, messages that painted Evan as careless and unprofessional. I had nothing to do with it. But karma, as it turns out, has excellent timing. Mara called me again. "Did you hear?" she whispered. "Your ex messed up big time." I pretended to hesitate. "Oh, that's unfortunate." She sighed. "You sound so calm." "I've had practice," I said. Meanwhile, Tessa's carefully curated life began to unravel in smaller, sweeter ways. She built her image around being the perfect sister who found love despite judgment. But cracks were showing. People had started noticing the things she borrowed from me. My old dress, my old recipes, even captions from posts I'd written years ago. The internet noticed. And the internet is merciless. Under one of her photos, someone commented, "Isn't that Lena's old outfit from the fundraiser last year?" Another chimed in. "Copying her again, I see." I didn't like or respond. But I read every word. Revenge doesn't always require effort. Sometimes it just needs patience. A month later, I got an email from a lifestyle magazine. They wanted to feature me in a segment called Reinvention After Heartbreak. Not a sob story, a success story. They loved the elegant rebrand, the quiet strength. When the article came out, it opened with a photo of me, confident, glowing, the kind of beauty that comes from knowing exactly who you are. And halfway through the feature, one sentence stood out. Lena's story reminds us that sometimes the best comeback is not loud, it's luminous. It trended for 2 days. I didn't tag anyone. But everyone knew. That evening, Evan texted me. It was short. "You look happy." I stared at it for a long moment before replying. "I am." No punctuation, no warmth, just fact. And that, somehow, hurt him more than anger ever could. Tessa called 3 days later. "I just wanted to talk," she said, her voice small, unsure. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she paused, waiting for kindness, I said, "You should talk to him." And I hung up. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Because revenge isn't about winning. It's about restoring the balance. And I'd finally done that. You don't rebuild to make them jealous. You rebuild so when they look back, they realize you were never theirs to ruin. Clapper board if you've ever rebuilt yourself quietly, stronger, sharper, softer in all the right places. Tell me in the comments. Would you have played it this calmly, or would you have gone louder? Speech balloon, and if you love stories where karma wears lipstick, make sure you subscribe for the next chapter of Everyday Dramas.
There's something poetic about watching people trip over the lies they told to make you look small. By summer, Evan and Tessa had become the picture-perfect couple on social media, all coastal brunches and stolen kisses in filtered sunlight. But even through a screen you could sense it, something brittle in their smiles, something desperate behind their captions. I didn't gloat. I just observed. The same way you might watch a storm forming at the edge of a sky you've already walked out from under. The first time I saw them in person again was at a gallery opening in the city. One of those soft-lit, champagne and whispers events where everyone pretends to care about abstract art while measuring each other's shoes and sorrow. I wore a black silk dress, simple, fluid, dangerous in its understatement, the kind of beauty that made people pause without knowing why. When I turned, they were there. Evan froze mid-step. Tessa's smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to see the panic flicker in her eyes before she forced it back. "Lena," she breathed, her tone dripping with fake warmth, "you look incredible." I smiled, "Thank you, I didn't recognize you without my things." The silence that followed was exquisite. A ripple of overheard curiosity moved through the crowd like perfume. I turned away before either could respond, letting my laughter drift behind me, soft, polished, untouchable. Later that night, I got a message from Mara. "You just broke the internet. That moment went viral, everyone's talking about it." Apparently, someone had recorded our little reunion. The clip was only 10 seconds long, but it was enough. My smile, Tessa's stiff laugh, Evan's expression, that mix of regret and realization that always comes too late. The caption someone added was brutal. "When you see what you lost and what she became." I didn't post it. I didn't share it. But I watched the views climb anyway. Meanwhile, cracks had begun to show in their perfect facade. A friend mentioned Tessa had been spotted leaving a restaurant in tears. Another whispered that Evan's firm was restructuring, which was polite code for you're being replaced. It wasn't my doing. It was simply the inevitable. When two people build something on betrayal, the foundation always shifts. Tessa had started comparing herself to me, and Evan resented it. She'd changed her hair, shorter now, closer to how I used to wear it. She even started a lifestyle blog about moving on with grace. The irony almost killed me. But no matter how much she mimicked, it never looked quite right. Her version of me was always louder, cheaper, more desperate for applause. And he saw it. Every day. One afternoon, I ran into him at a coffee shop downtown. He looked tired, not the charming kind of tired, but the kind that comes from pretending too long. He smiled weakly. "Lena, you look well." "I am," I said simply. There was a pause. He waited for me to ask how he was. I didn't. When I turned to leave, he said softly, "I miss how calm it was with you." I glanced over my shoulder. That's because chaos doesn't argue, Evan, it just leaves when it's done. That night I hosted a small dinner, friends, laughter, candles flickering over glasses of rosé. I looked around and realized something quietly profound. I wasn't angry anymore. Revenge had done its work, not in destruction but in distance. I no longer needed them to crumble. It was enough that they had to watch me live beautifully. I stopped proving my worth the moment I realized they'd already lost the privilege of seeing it. And that's the thing about karma, it never shouts. It just lets the mirror crack slowly until they can't stand their own reflection. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only for life to show them who you truly were? Tell me in the comments, I love hearing your stories. And if you believe revenge can be silent, elegant, and absolutely satisfying, subscribe for the next chapter of everyday dramas. There's something about public events, the perfume of pretense, the flash of borrowed diamonds that makes hypocrisy almost glamorous. That night, the city's elite gathered for the Hearts and Heritage Gala, a fundraiser dripping with old money, new ambition, and the kind of smiles that never reach the eyes. I wasn't planning to attend. But then I saw Tessa's post. Honored to co-chair this year's gala with my wonderful husband, Evan, read grateful for second chances and real love. Second chances, real love. It was almost poetic, how far she'd go to prove she'd won. So yes, I went. The ballroom was a masterpiece, chandeliers like captured constellations, soft violins humming through golden light. People turned when I walked in, subtle assessing. They always did that now. I wore ivory silk, not red, not black, just calm, deliberate understatement. And then I saw her, Tessa, standing near the stage in a glittering gown far too loud for her. She spotted me and I saw her spine straighten, that small, nervous shift of a woman trying to hold her composure. Lena, she said, all honeyed surprise, didn't expect to see you here. I smiled. Oh, I couldn't resist. I've always loved a family event. Her jaw tightened. It's not really that. Of course not, I said. You've made sure of that. The speeches began. Tessa took the stage, all nerves disguised as grace. She thanked the sponsors, spoke about love, forgiveness, women supporting women. It was going fine until the slideshow started. A soft instrumental score played, images projected behind her, donors, committee members, their work for the cause. Then one photo froze. It was her. In my old wedding dress. Not a similar one. Mine. I'd loaned it to a designer friend years ago. She'd used it in a private collection shoot. Apparently, Tessa had borrowed it for her charity portrait. And now it was 20 feet high on the screen, glowing behind her, the symbol of everything she'd taken. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Lena?" Tessa froze. Her voice faltered mid-sentence. Evan's face, pale, tight-lipped, said everything. I didn't move. Didn't smirk. Didn't even blink. I simply reached for a flute of champagne, raised it slightly toward the screen, and said softly to the woman beside me, "Recycling truly is good for the planet." She laughed too loudly, and others joined, unsure why but sensing they should. Within minutes, the entire room had turned. Not cruelly, worse. Pityingly. And in society, pity is fatal. Tessa tried to recover, stammering through the rest of her speech, but the magic was gone. The applause was polite, brief, suffocating. When she stepped off stage, she looked for me. I was already gone. The next morning, the photos were everywhere. Side-by-side comparisons, my wedding photo and her gala portrait. Hashtags sister style. History repeats borrowed bride. Even tabloids that used to fawn over her now called it tone-deaf, desperate, a PR nightmare. And through it all, I said nothing. Because that's the rule of elegant revenge. You never add commentary when the world does it for you. That weekend, she deleted her accounts. Evan predictably went silent. I heard whispers about fights, about space, about her crying in a restaurant bathroom. I didn't feel joy. Just balance. Like watching a clock finally tick back into rhythm. And when Mara called shrieking, "Lena, you saw what happened, right?" I only said. I told her once that some things shouldn't be stolen. She thought I meant jewelry. When they turn your life into a spectacle. Don't hide. Wait. The curtain always falls. After the gala, the city moved on. But people remember humiliation the way perfume lingers on silk, faint, but impossible to wash out completely. I didn't hear from Tessa for weeks. Not that I expected to. Silence was her new language now, and I'd learned it fluently long before she did. One afternoon, I was having coffee at my favorite corner cafe, the kind of place with antique mirrors and sunlight that flatters everyone, when I saw her outside. Alone, head down, sunglasses on. Her posture was different, smaller somehow, like someone trying to take up less space in a world that had finally stopped clapping for her. For a moment I almost felt pity, almost. Then I remembered the look on her face the day she told me about Evan, that mix of triumph and apology that wasn't really either. And the pity dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. She chose this. Every consequence she now wore like a designer label, had her own initials stitched inside. Evan, meanwhile, had begun to haunt mutual circles again, alone. He'd shown up at a networking event Mara attended, made polite conversation, tried to sound unaffected. But according to her, he'd lost that shine, the one that made people lean in. He was present but forgettable. It's funny how losing the right woman can dim a man's entire energy. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail, no name, just my address. Inside was a letter in Tessa's handwriting. Lena, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I can't keep living in a house that feels like your shadow. He doesn't love me the way he loved you, he never did. I thought I won, but I only inherited your silence. There was a photo clipped to it, their wedding day. They both looked stunning but not happy. Now that I saw it again, the smiles were more like masks. I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope and tucked it into a drawer, not out of sentiment but preservation. Some things don't need closure, they just need to stay exactly where they belong, in the past. That night I hosted another small dinner. Laughter, soft jazz, people who saw me for what I'd become, not what I'd survived. Someone asked, Lena, don't you ever get tired of pretending everything's fine? I smiled. Oh, I stopped pretending a long time ago, now it just is. And I meant it. Tessa moved out of their house a month later. Evan sold it soon after. Their story ended not in fire or fury, but in quiet resignation, the kind that hurts more because it's ordinary. Mine, on the other hand, was still unfolding, brighter, cleaner, and entirely mine. Revenge isn't the opposite of forgiveness. It's what happens when you forgive yourself first. By autumn, my name had become palatable again. People who once whispered about my messy divorce now used words like resilient, graceful, redefined. That's the thing about society, it forgives the woman who rises, but only after she's done bleeding. The feature came first. Modern Grace magazine. They called it The Art of Rebuilding, Lena Hart on power, poise and starting over. I almost said no. But my publicist, yes, I had one now, insisted. Let them tell your story, she said, just make sure you own the ending. The interview took place in my apartment, sunlight pouring through floor-length windows, soft jazz humming in the background. The journalist, a woman my age with curious eyes, smiled as she settled her recorder on the coffee table. Everyone talks about how you disappeared, she said. Then suddenly you re-emerged glowing. What changed? I sipped my tea, smiled faintly. Nothing, I said. I just stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. She laughed, the knowing kind. That line would end up as the pull quote in bold print, shared across half the internet. The article went viral within hours. People reposted snippets, captions like, "She didn't rebuild for them, she rebuilt for herself." The quiet kind of power hits differently. Women began tagging me in posts, Lena mindset, silent power, everyday grace. I'd become a symbol I never set out to be. And it was strangely satisfying. Because every compliment, every quote, every ounce of admiration, they were all built on the ashes of what my sister thought she'd taken from me. A week later came the speaking invitation. The Women in Reinvention Conference. They wanted me to share my journey. The irony didn't escape me. The event was held at a luxury hotel downtown, Chandeliers, velvet chairs, the usual self-congratulatory ambience. I stood backstage, calm, composed. Through the curtains, I could see familiar faces, some I hadn't seen since the scandal. Even Mara mouthed, "You've got this." When they called my name, the applause surprised me. It wasn't polite, it was genuine. I walked to the podium in a tailored ivory suit this time. No armor, just truth. I smiled at the crowd, let the silence settle before I spoke. When I lost everything, I began, people told me to fight back. But I learned that not every battle needs a war. Some people destroy themselves trying to prove they've won. The audience went still. Phones lifted, cameras clicked. I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. Everyone knew the story, everyone knew the ending. Halfway through my speech, I saw them. Evan and Tessa. Back of the room. He looked like a ghost of ambition. She looked older somehow, not in years but in spirit. Our eyes met briefly. I held her gaze and said, "Forgiveness isn't about setting them free. It's about freeing yourself from needing to be understood." Her eyes lowered. After the event, people crowded around, handshakes, compliments, flashes of cameras. Someone asked if I'd ever thank those who hurt me. I smiled. "Oh, I already did," I said, "by living beautifully." That night, as I scrolled through the clips online, I came across a comment that stopped me cold. Funny how the same crowd that mocked her now worships her. Society doesn't love strength, it loves spectacle. I smiled. Because the commenter wasn't wrong. But what they didn't understand was, I wasn't performing anymore. They wanted a scandal. I gave them a story. And somewhere between pity and applause, I found myself. There's a quiet moment that comes after a storm, when the world feels suspended, and even the air seems to wait for you to breathe again. That's where I found myself, 1 year after everything fell apart. Not victorious. Not bitter. Just free. The city was beginning to turn golden again, that soft, forgiving hue of late autumn when even endings look romantic. I'd been invited to a private retreat for women entrepreneurs in upstate New York, an old estate turned boutique resort. They wanted me to give the opening talk. Not as a survivor, not as the ex-wife, but as Lena Hart, founder of the Reclaim Collective. It still felt strange, my name and title being spoken in the same sentence again. Strange and satisfying. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine and vintage linen. The house itself was the kind of beauty that made silence comfortable, creaking floors, sunlight slanting through lace curtains, a piano no one played anymore. My suite overlooked the lake. In the distance, a pair of swans glided across the water, effortless, identical, unbothered. I thought of Tessa for a fleeting second. Then I didn't. That evening they held a dinner, candlelight laughter, soft jazz echoing against marble. Women in silk and confidence filled the room. No envy, no competition, just the shared understanding that we'd all bled in our own ways and learned to wear the scars like silk ribbons. Someone asked me to make a toast. I stood, glass in hand. "I used to think revenge was loud," I said softly, "that it looked like winning, but it's quieter than that. It's waking up one day and realizing you've stopped needing to be understood by people who never deserved to know you." The applause was gentle, sincere. I smiled, not the kind I used to fake for cameras, but the kind that comes from peace that can't be shaken anymore. The next morning, after the event, I stopped by a small cafe in town before driving back to the city. It was quaint, handwritten menus, a bell that jingled when you entered, the kind of place where time forgot to hurry. And that's where it happened. I looked up and there they were. Evan and Tessa. They were sitting by the window, quiet, older. He looked weathered, his charm worn down to politeness. She looked fragile, trying too hard to seem fine. Their table was half-finished coffee, untouched croissants, and silence heavy enough to fill the room. He noticed me first. Our eyes met, a flicker of recognition, guilt, and something close to admiration. Tessa turned slowly, her breath catching when she saw me. Her eyes darted away immediately, as if looking at me cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. I didn't stop. I just smiled faintly, walked to the counter and ordered my coffee. The barista, not recognizing the tension thick in the air, asked for my name for the cup. Lena, I said. I heard the name land between us like a soft, deliberate echo. When I turned to leave, I paused for half a second, not for them, but for myself. Because I realized that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. Or pity. Or even triumph. Just distance. I'd become everything they tried to convince me I couldn't be, not by outshining them, but by outgrowing them. And they both knew it. That was the last word, unspoken but deafening. As I stepped outside, the morning sun caught on the glass door, turning my reflection into a shimmer. For a heartbeat, I didn't see the woman who'd been betrayed. I saw the woman who'd built her life back, slow, deliberate, unbreakable. In the reflection, a car passed, its window catching mine, and I thought, maybe they're still watching me drive away. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't driving away anymore. I was driving forward. That night I posted one photo from the retreat, me on the balcony, hair loose, coffee in hand, morning mist behind me. No caption, just a single emoji. The comments said everything. Peace looks good on you. The comeback we all needed. This isn't revenge, this is rebirth. And maybe that's what it really was. Revenge was never the goal, it was just the bridge. Peace was the destination. Sometimes the sweetest sound isn't an apology. It's silence. Because you've finally stopped waiting for it. Clap aboard if you've ever rebuilt yourself quietly, stronger, softer, smarter, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your rebirth story. Speech balloon, and if you believe the best revenge is peace, subscribe for more everyday dramas. Because sometimes the ending isn't about them at all. It's about you.